Sometimes life's most transformative moments don't come with fanfare or forewarning, but arrive quietly tucked between the most ordinary of circumstances, like waiting in line at an airport gate or hearing a baby cry during boarding. And if you blink or rush past too quickly, you might miss them entirely because true character isn't revealed in moments of comfort, it's revealed in moments of inconvenience. And that's exactly what happened to Luke Harrison, a widowed single father from Detroit who had no idea that his small act of compassion on a plane would set in motion a sequence of events that would completely redefine his life and the lives of those around him. Luke was the kind of man who moved through the world without needing applause. He worked long hours at a local garage raising his 10-year-old son Ethan alone after losing his wife to illness. And though his life was far from easy, he didn't carry it like a burden. He carried it like a commitment, one forged from love and grief and the deep knowledge that his son needed more presence than perfection. So when his name was unexpectedly selected through a quiet airline program that recognized everyday heroes and resilience with a free first-class ticket to San Francisco for a rare father-son weekend, Luke hesitated at first but accepted after Ethan's face lit up with the kind of joy that comes from imagining adventure and connection, and so on a quiet. Friday morning, they arrived at the airport with matching backpacks and a secondhand suitcase ready not for luxury, but for time together. What Luke didn't know was that sitting just a few rows behind him in economy class was a young woman barely managing a red-faced baby who wouldn't stop crying. No matter how many lullabies she whispered or bottles she offered, other passengers were beginning to stare. Some rolled their eyes, others pulled out headphones and sighed audibly. And the flight attendant glanced at the mother with the kind of tight-lipped sympathy that says, "I understand, but I can't help." And when Luke noticed the growing tension around her, he stood up, walked down the aisle, and quietly said, "Excuse me, would you like to switch seats? I'm in first class," and without waiting for applause or even a thank you, he took her boarding stub, handed her his, and moved to her cramped aisle seat near the galley, where he sat down, adjusted his posture, and offered the baby a soft smile. The mother, stunned, whispered, "Thank you," with tears forming in her eyes and walked toward the front of the plane with her baby, now slowly settling. And Luke didn't announce what he'd done. He didn't make a show of it, but several nearby passengers watched him with a new kind of respect, not because he had done something grand, but because he had done something good. The truth is, this kind of kindness isn't about heroism, it's about presence. And in our world today, where people are often celebrated for what they accumulate rather than how they treat others, gestures like Luke's shine brighter because they are rare. And in that moment, a quiet mechanic from Detroit reminded everyone on that plane that compassion doesn't require wealth or power, only a willingness to see someone else's struggle and offer comfort anyway. What's even more powerful is that Luke's actions didn't stop there during the flight. A small child sitting across from him began crying and complaining about ear pressure. And while his own son, Ethan, calmly read a comic book, Luke pulled out a trick his late wife used to do. He reached into his bag, took out a napkin, and showed the child how to mimic a breathing technique to ease the discomfort. And within minutes, the child settled. His mother whispered, "Thank you," and Luke simply nodded, returning to his seat as if this were the most natural thing in the world. And for him, it was because that's who he was, someone who noticed someone who cared. And while the rest of the flight passed without further incident, something had quietly shifted, and what no one knew, not even Luke, was that the woman he had given his seat to was not just a young mother. She was Amelia Grant, the CEO of Sky Harbor Airlines, traveling incognito without her entourage or staff, hoping to make it back home with her newborn after visiting a family member and trying to grasp the overwhelming complexity of balancing her new role as a mother with her high-profile career. And what struck her most wasn't the comfort of first class, but the sheer selflessness of a stranger who had given up something he'd earned without asking for anything in return. And that act stayed with her like a gentle tap on the shoulder, reminding her of a world she had become slightly detached from in her climb to the top. And as the plane landed and passengers disembarked, Amelia paused near the jet bridge. Waiting for the man who had changed seats, she approached Luke, now helping Ethan with his backpack, and introduced herself not as a CEO, but simply as the woman with the baby. And when she thanked him, he smiled quietly and said, "I figured you needed it more than I did and started to walk away. But Amelia called after him, pulled a business card from her coat, and said, "If you ever need anything, please call me Luke." Pocketed the card more out of politeness than expectation, and continued on his way, unaware that what he had just done would ripple far beyond that gate. And here's where the story moves beyond chance and into something deeper. Because while many of us have heard stories of good deeds being rewarded, the truth is that Luke didn't do what he did for attention. He did it because that's how he lived his life. And what makes that remarkable is that in a culture increasingly driven by self-interest and performance, real kindness is often mistaken for weakness or naivety. But those who have truly suffered like Luke, who have lost and grieved and rebuilt themselves from the inside out, know that empathy isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And that kind of empathy leaves a mark not just on those who receive it, but on those who witness it. And Amelia, who had built a career balancing stockholder expectations, brand reputation, and corporate leadership, suddenly found herself reevaluating what leadership really looked like. And in Luke, she saw something profoundly grounding, a reminder that no title or achievement can replace the power of basic human dignity. And this is where we'll continue in the next section as a simple gesture begins to unfold into something much greater than anyone could have predicted. In the days that followed, Luke didn't think much about the flight or the business card tucked in his coat pocket. His mind was already back in the rhythm of repair calls, oil changes, school lunches, and making sure Ethan finished his homework before they watched the same superhero movie for the fifth time in a row. But one afternoon after closing up the garage, he found a package sitting on the front step, a sleek envelope with a handwritten note. And when he opened it, he found something he never expected: a letter from Amelia, not printed or formal, but personal, written in blue ink that wavered slightly, as if the writer had paused often and thought deeply. Before continuing in it, she thanked him again. Not just for giving up his seat, but for what he taught her that day about presence, about grace, and about how sometimes the people who appear the most ordinary are carrying the greatest weight. And with the letter was a slim black case inside it, a lifetime first-class access card engraved with his name and a second card for Ethan. The note concluded with a simple line: "You reminded me what leadership is, and we could use more people like you." Luke stared at the letter for a long time, unsure how to respond, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he didn't feel he had done anything to deserve such a response. And that's something we rarely talk about: the way truly good people often feel uncomfortable when acknowledged for their goodness, because they don't see it as exceptional, they see it as normal. Luke was one of those people, and when he finally told Ethan about the gift, the boy's eyes lit up, not because of the fancy travel perks, but because for once his dad, who so often worked behind the scenes, was being seen. And the next morning, something even more unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled into the garage lot and out stepped Amelia, this time in her professional element, but with none of the distance or polish you might expect from someone in her position. She held her daughter on her hip, offered Luke a grateful smile, and said, "I thought thank you wasn't enough and wanted to say it in person again." And that was the start of something neither of them could have predicted, because while the media might paint their meeting as a fairy tale of chance, what really unfolded was far more human. Amelia didn't swoop in to change Luke's life, and Luke didn't see her as a symbol of power or escape. They talked not about corporate strategy or sacrifice, but about parenting, about the moments that aren't glamorous, like when your child has a meltdown in a grocery aisle, or when you cry in the shower because holding it together all day has left you exhausted. And that level of honesty is what began to bridge their worlds. And over the next few weeks, Amelia visited the garage a few more times, not with pomp or press, but as a person who had found a moment of peace in a space that smelled like grease and old coffee. Luke, while never one to chase anything, began to look forward to those visits the way he used to look forward to Sunday mornings with his wife, slow and sacred. And while neither of them said anything about feelings, it was clear something was growing, something rooted not in fantasy but in shared experience and mutual respect. And that's the kind of relationship most people overlook when searching for love. They chase spark and forget about steadiness. But in the real world, the strongest connections often begin with showing up consistently and listening without trying to fix. And what Luke and Amelia were building was exactly that. And one night while sitting on a bench outside the garage as Ethan practiced basketball nearby, Amelia shared something she hadn't told anyone, that after having her daughter, she had nearly walked away from her company, not because she didn't love her job, but because she felt like she was losing herself in the process. And it was only after that flight, only after watching someone choose kindness when no one was watching, that she remembered what kind of leader she wanted to be. And that's something many people wrestle with, especially women in high-powered positions who are expected to lead like machines and parent like saints, and when they fail to be perfect in both, they're told to try harder. But what Amelia saw in Luke was not perfection, but integrity, and that gave her permission to be more fully human. And as they continued to spend time together, including a weekend where she invited Luke and Ethan to a community family event hosted by Sky Harbor, something remarkable happened. The people around them began to notice that leadership wasn't about titles, it was about presence. Luke brought that presence everywhere he went, quietly, helping a nervous teen prepare for a speech, calming a crying toddler whose parent was overwhelmed, even offering tips to a young intern about changing a flat tire. And it's no surprise then that Amelia eventually asked him to consult on a new program within the airline, a customer experience initiative aimed at training staff not just in efficiency, but in empathy. And at first, Luke hesitated, unsure if he belonged in that world. But Amelia said something he couldn't ignore. She said, "Our company doesn't need more experts. We need more people who remember what it feels like to be human." And so he agreed, not as a career move, but as a chance to make life better for someone else. And this mirrors something we're seeing in the real world. More companies are beginning to realize that emotional intelligence is not a soft skill, it's a leadership asset, and customer experience is no longer about speed alone, it's about emotional touchpoints. Brands like Patagonia, Zappos, and even Delta have begun hiring based on values, not just resumes, because they've learned that people remember how you make them feel. And Luke embodied that every day, and as his role grew, so did the connection between him and Amelia. No longer just casual conversations, but deeper trust, dinner at her home with Ethan and her daughter, impromptu visits where Luke fixed her leaky faucet and stayed to help clean the kitchen, late-night calls, where they talked not just about work, but about what scared them, what they hoped for, what they missed. And though neither used the word love, it hung in the air like a scent they both recognized but were too cautious to name just yet. And one night after a successful employee training pilot, Luke stood outside Amelia's office looking out over the city, and she joined him and said, "You make this better." And he looked at her and replied, "So do you." And for a moment, everything else faded. Because when you meet someone who sees you without asking you to explain who you were or prove who you'll be, it's not just connection, it's healing. And that's where we'll continue next as love begins to take root. Not through grand gestures, but through the daily quiet decision to stay. As weeks passed, the rhythm of their lives began to intertwine, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Luke continued to work part-time at the garage while traveling to help with the airline's empathy training program, and Amelia began leaning more into the kind of leadership that wasn't driven by quarterly reports, but by conscious culture building. And while they never labeled what was forming between them, it was clear that something significant had taken root. A kind of intimacy built not through declarations, but through patterns, the way Luke always brought coffee to her office before meetings, the way Amelia kept an extra toy in her purse for Ethan, the way they both knew when the other needed a quiet pause more than conversation. And it was in this rhythm that something shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt one evening after a long day. Amelia invited Luke and Ethan over for dinner, and while the kids were occupied, she walked into the kitchen and simply asked Luke, "Do you ever think about the future?" And that question hung in the air, heavy with possibility, because neither of them had truly said what this was between them and Luke being. Luke took a moment to answer before saying, "I think about it more than I let on." And that admission cracked something open, not just in Amelia, but in the atmosphere between them. And they both stood there unsure of what came next until her daughter cried, and the moment was suspended, but not forgotten. And over the next few days, the question lingered, and with it came old fears for Amelia. It was the fear of falling too hard too fast, only to be left behind again. And for Luke, it was the fear that he wasn't enough, not successful enough, not polished enough, not prepared to carry someone else's heart when he was still patching up his own. And that's what makes this story real, because in truth, love after loss isn't about fairy tale resolution. It's about choosing someone. Despite the lingering ghosts, and both of them had those ghosts, Amelia carried the pressure of being a woman at the top, expected to smile through everything, even exhaustion. Luke carried the weight of quiet grief, never fully spoken, but always present like a familiar ache, and in many ways they were still learning to speak the same emotional language. But what bridged that gap was the small, steady acts that said, "I'm staying." And while the outside world still saw them as opposites, the CEO and the mechanic, the truth was they were more alike than anyone knew. Both had built resilience through heartbreak. Both knew how to hold space for someone without trying to fix them. And both had grown into the kind of adults their children could look up to, not for perfection, but for presence. And yet every love story reaches a tipping point, and for them it came unexpectedly during a staff event where Amelia had asked Luke to speak about the importance of frontline empathy. And he did with grace, humor, and humility. But afterward, when a reporter cornered him for an impromptu interview and asked what it was like to be dating the CEO of Sky Harbor, he was caught off guard and stumbled through a vague, polite answer, one that didn't confirm or deny anything. And that moment, however unintentional, rippled back to Amelia, who read the headline the next day with a tightness in her chest. Because for her, being hidden felt like a step backward, like being kept in the margins of someone's life. And while she understood Luke's instinct to protect their privacy, it brought back old wounds of being the woman people were proud of, privately but distant from publicly. And so that evening, they talked not with raised voices, but with quiet hurt. When she asked him why he hesitated, Luke admitted something he hadn't said aloud. "I'm afraid I'll never be enough for you." And that sentence broke her heart, not because it wasn't true, but because it revealed just how deeply he doubted his own worth. And in that moment, Amelia didn't offer a pep talk. She simply sat beside him, took his hand, and said, "You're not enough because of what you do. You're enough because of who you are." And that truth settled between them like a balm, not a fix, but a reminder. And they sat there for a long time, just breathing through the tension, letting it exist without needing to solve it immediately. And that's a lesson many couples learn late, that conflict doesn't mean failure. It means two people are trying to love each other through their wounds. And that's where the real work of love begins. And for Luke, that moment became a turning point. He began owning his presence, not just in private, but in public, proudly attending events with Amelia, participating more in leadership meetings and allowing his voice to be heard, not because he sought attention, but because he realized his story had weight and worth. And for Amelia, it became a chance to soften, to let someone else share the weight she'd carried for so long alone. And that's something especially powerful for women in leadership, because so often they are taught to be strong at the expense of connection, to lead without leaning. In Luke, she found not a crutch, but a partner, someone who didn't want to lead for her, but with her. And this mirrors what we see in real-world relationships that work best when rooted in emotional equity, where vulnerability is not a weakness, but a tool of intimacy and shared growth. And that dynamic began to reflect in how their children interacted too. Ethan grew close to Amelia's daughter, teaching her little jokes, reading her bedtime stories, helping her find shells at the park. And Amelia began to see that this wasn't just a love story between two adults. It was the weaving of two families into something new and organic. And one night after a long workday, Luke picked up a takeaway dinner and brought it to Amelia's place. And after they ate and cleaned up and the kids were asleep, he sat with her on the couch and said, "I was thinking maybe it's time we stopped dancing around this and started building something for real." And Amelia looked at him, eyes soft and tired and hopeful, and said, "I've been waiting for you to say that." And no grand gesture followed, just the quiet joining of two lives, inch by inch, choice by choice. And that's where we'll continue next as love takes form. Not through fantasy, but through commitment and creation, and the choice to build something real together. As summer turned to fall, the routines they had slowly built began to feel less like trial runs and more like home. Luke would drop Ethan at school, then head to work on a hybrid schedule, balancing garage repairs and empathy sessions at the airline, while Amelia restructured parts of her executive team to prioritize humanity alongside innovation. And their lives didn't become perfect. They became intentional. There were days filled with stress and sleepless nights when Amelia's daughter wouldn't stop crying or Luke worried about missing Ethan's science fair. But what defined them wasn't the absence of conflict. It was their ability to meet each challenge as a team. And that's what love becomes when two people who have known loss begin to hope again. It's not about pretending pain never existed. It's about creating a life big enough to hold it. And one morning as they sat quietly on Amelia's back porch, watching the kids chase bubbles through the autumn wind, she reached over, took Luke's hand, and asked, "Do you think it's time?" And he didn't need to ask what she meant because they'd been talking around it for weeks, merging homes, building something permanent. And he nodded and simply said, "If you're ready, I am." And within a month, they had settled into a new place together, modest but warm, filled with mismatched furniture, kids' drawings on the fridge, and routines that felt like rituals, Sunday pancakes with too much syrup, Wednesday story nights where everyone piled onto one couch, and Friday game nights where Ethan always tried to cheat at Uno and lost anyway. And in between all of it were moments when Luke would glance at Amelia across the dinner table, or while she braided her daughter's hair and think, "How did I get here?" And the answer was always the same. You chose to show up again and again. And it's that theme, the power of consistent presence, that runs like a thread through every meaningful relationship, not just romantic ones, but between parents and children, friends and neighbors, even strangers who offer help when no one's looking. Because real transformation doesn't usually come from grand gestures. It comes from quiet faithfulness, and Luke knew this, which is why he started planning something not flashy, but thoughtful, a way to ask Amelia the question that had been forming on his tongue for weeks. He brought Ethan in. On it, asked for his help choosing a ring, and one crisp Saturday afternoon they drove out to an old airfield Amelia used to visit with her father, a place she'd once told Luke was where she fell in love with the idea of flying, and he set up a simple table with a picnic blanket and brought a thermos of coffee the way she liked it. When she arrived with the kids, Luke greeted her with a smile that said, "This is for you," and after they'd eaten and the kids had run off to play near the old hangar, he turned to her, pulled out a small box and said, "I didn't fall in love with the CEO. I fell in love with the woman who cries when she watches her daughter sleep, who listens like it's an art and loves like it's a promise. And I want to keep choosing you. If you'll let me." And Amelia, for once, was speechless and then said yes with tears that felt like release, not pressure. And the children ran back at that exact moment, asking what was happening. And when Amelia showed them the ring, Ethan gave a thumbs up while her daughter clapped, without understanding why. And it was perfect, not because everything was easy, but because it was real. And they married quietly the following spring in a backyard garden surrounded by the people who had become part of their journey. Co-workers, neighbors, mechanics from the garage, flight attendants from the airline, and even passengers who had reached out after hearing Luke's story. And it wasn't glamorous, but it was full of life and love and laughter. And after the vows, Ethan stood up and read a poem he had written that ended with the line, "This is what it means to land safely," and no one had a dry eye. Not even Amelia, who had once trained herself not to cry in front of boardrooms. And in the months that followed, their life expanded in ways they never imagined. They launched a scholarship fund for single parents entering trade work or aviation, and partnered with a nonprofit to turn airport lounges into family-friendly spaces, because they knew firsthand how overwhelming travel could be for parents alone. And the ripple effect of their love continued not through press releases, but through people quietly choosing kindness because of what they saw in Luke. Amelia, and here's where we step back and ask what this story really gives us beyond emotion and catharsis. And the answer is this: a reminder that extraordinary change begins with ordinary kindness. And the people who shape our lives most profoundly are often the ones who choose to give up their seat so someone else can rest. And that love in its most enduring form is not grand or loud or spotless. It's steady, it's patient, it's the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. It's the belief that someone's presence can matter more than their perfection. And in Luke, we saw how grief doesn't end you, it reshapes you. And in Amelia, we saw how leadership doesn't mean doing it alone. It means leading with heart. And when those two truths found each other, they built not a fairy tale, but a home. And in a world full of curated moments and filtered lives, this story offers something beautifully unfiltered, a man who didn't need to be extraordinary to change someone's world. and a woman who learned that. Vulnerability wasn't her weakness, it was her strength, and together they taught us that sometimes the smallest decision can lead to the biggest transformation. And if you're still watching, if this story touched something in you, then carry this forward. Let your kindness ripple, help someone who can't pay you back. Love without needing credit, and never underestimate what one act of selflessness can become, because someone out there might be waiting for you to make the choice that changes everything.